We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
You're listening to Carousel Sniper Victim, a Dead Glass Design production, with your host, Shaun Jeffery.
When you're a young child and you're growing up, if you get sent to your room, it seems like the worst thing ever. I hate you, Mum. I hate you, Dad. Shut up. Commence little hissy fit, cue bedroom door slamming. When I grow up, everything will make sense and it'll all be cool. Cue reality, and bam, you're an adult. And one day you realise that being sent to your room was nothing, and in hindsight, you'd take that over any amount of bullshit power bills or adult nonsense that we all have to deal with. But sometimes, some people take sending someone to their room to a whole new level, and you enter a whole new realm of physical and psychological horror. Spending any long amount of time confined to a room is an uncomfortable existence. So just try and imagine being confined to a room for 25 years. Ever get a little bit claustrophobic from sitting in the office too long at work? The lack of interaction and the longing to just see some sunlight alone is enough for someone to want to develop a smoking habit just so they have an excuse to leave. Now imagine you were confined to a room smaller than your cubicle for 25 years. There is no light. There's no heating or air conditioning. Just the monotonous, nagging inner voices that isolation brings. The only food you eat are scraps from someone else's table. And your only friends, the rats who scavenge what little crumbs fall to the stony floor. Mademoiselle Blanche Monnier, a beautiful 25-year young lady living in Poitiers, France, experienced this hellish existence for a quarter of a century. The city of Poitiers lies on the Clain River in west-central France and is a major educational centre for the region. The centre of town is picturesque and its streets include predominantly historical architecture, religious architecture, and especially architecture from the Romanesque period. Two major military battles took place near the city in its past. In the year 732 current era, the Battle of Poitiers, also known as the Battle of Tours, in which the Franks, commanded by Charles Martel, halted the expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate. And in the year 1356 CE, another Battle of Poitiers, a key victory for the English forces during the 100 Years' War. Poitiers was a city of high socialite types, big bonnets and top hats and lots of oui oui. During the 19th century, many army bases were built in Poitiers because of its central and strategic location. Poitiers became a garrison town, despite its distance from France's borders. The Poitiers train station was built in the 1850s, and it connected Poitiers to the rest of France. Mademoiselle Blanche Monnier was a beautiful French socialite living in Poitiers, a mere 4 hours away from Paris in 1876. At the time, she was just 25 years old. Blanche Monnier was an attractive young woman with many hopeful suitors, She came from a successful family and so was well known around town, which is why it was all the more strange when she suddenly disappeared. Mademoiselle Monnier simply vanished from the public eye. Many found this odd. After all, her family was kept in high regard, and she was looking for a potential suitor for marriage. But she didn't actually disappear. She was imprisoned by her own mother, Madame Louise Monnier. Allegedly, the neighbours knew of Blanche's imprisonment, as they often heard her screaming in the room. If anyone ever asked Madame Monnier what was going on, she claimed Blanche had gone insane. At the time, it was standard procedure to keep insane members under lock and key, and so no one pressed the issue. Madame Monnier did not simply keep Blanche out of the public eye though. Blanche was padlocked in a dark, windowless room. She had no interaction with any other people, save for her mother, brother, and occasional servant who would throw her some table scraps. Blanche was left completely naked, was sparsely fed, and was not permitted any sort of basic hygienic routine. She laid in her bed for most of her life, which is also where she ate, urinated, and defecated. She never bathed. Slowly, she became more and more malnourished. Filth piled up around her, and this attracted rats and bugs, her only companions for 25 grueling years. As Blanche Monnier laid in her dark room for year after agonizing year, she slowly went insane. Wouldn't you? On the 23rd of May, 1901, the Paris Attorney General received the following anonymously posted letter, which read, "Monsieur Attorney General, I have the honour to inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I speak of a spinster who is locked up in Madame Monnier's house, half-starved, and living on a putrid litter for the past 25 years. In a word, in her own filth." Blanche's mother, Madame Monnier, was at the time a 75-year-old widow who lived in her upper-class estate with her lawyer son, Marcel, both well-respected French socialites. Surely this letter was just someone making false accusations. The house referred to in the letter was located in an upscale neighbourhood in the French city of Poitiers. The Attorney General notified local police and asked them to investigate, but nobody expected anything to come of it. According to police who knew the area well, the only two people living at the address mentioned in the letter were Madame Louise Monnier and her middle-aged son, Marcel. Both Monniers had lived exemplary lives. Marcel was a law school graduate and a former sub-prefect. Madame Monnier's husband, Emile, had been the head of the local arts faculty prior to his death in 1879. While Madame Monnier herself belonged to the illustrious Poitiers family, the city was named after her family. She had even received an award from the Committee of Good Works for her philanthropic deeds. Some of the older police officers were able to recall one other strange detail, however. Madame Monnier had a beautiful daughter named Blanche, who had apparently vanished without a trace 25 years earlier. Amazingly enough, the disappearance of a young socialite had somehow taken place without any police investigation or alarm being raised by her own family. Despite the odd nature of the disappearance, nobody had any idea of what would follow, or the heartbreaking story that had remained hidden for decades. When the police arrived, they proceeded to search the house and quickly found an upstairs room, which had been padlocked shut. Breaking the door open, they were horrified to find Blanche Monnier, naked, emaciated, and with her head buried under the covers. According to an account by one of the officers, quote, "We immediately gave the order to open the casement window. This was done with great difficulty, for the old, dark-coloured curtains fell down in a heavy shower of dust. To open the shutters, it was necessary to remove them from their right hinges. As soon as light entered the room, we noticed, in the back, lying on a bed, her head and body covered by a repulsively filthy blanket, a woman identified as Mademoiselle Blanche Monnier. The unfortunate woman was lying completely naked on a rotten straw mattress. All around her was formed a sort of crust made up from excrement, fragments of meat, vegetables, fish, and rotten bread. We also saw oyster shells and bugs running across Mademoiselle Monnier's bed. The air was so unbreathable, the odour given off by the room was so rank, that it was impossible for us to stay any longer to proceed with our investigation. Terrified at the sight of strangers, Blanche continued to hide her head under a blanket. She was quickly wrapped in a blanket and taken to a hospital in Paris for observation. Weighing a mere 55 pounds at the time of her discovery, that's not even 30 kilos. Blanche seemed incapable of any kind of coherent speech and was visibly frightened at being exposed to sunlight. As they would later discover, she hadn't seen the sun in nearly 25 years. Police examining the miserable cell where she had been kept found the word liberté, liberty, scratched across the walls. They also determined that Blanche hadn't worn clothing for the previous at least 20 years, and her only friends were the rats that scrambled to eat the crumbs scattered on the floor of her room. Even as police were sending her off to hospital, Blanche's elderly mother simply sat in the living room, apparently stunned at what was happening. After police finished searching the house, they then proceeded to question Madame Monnier and her son. While Marcel continued to bluster and insisted that his sister was, quote, foul, angry, overly excited, and full of rage, end quote, the doctors examining her at the hospital simply saw a frail and almost mute middle-aged woman who seemed excited at being given a bath and given new clothes. It was only after both Monniers were arrested that police interrogators managed to unravel the entire horrific story. 25 years earlier, Blanche had been a vivacious and attractive 25-year-old socialite, facing pressure from her mother to find a suitable husband. Among her many suitors happened to be an older attorney who lived nearby with whom Blanche fell in love. After becoming intimate, and more than intimate according to some accounts, it was her announcement to her family that she wanted to marry this attorney that the trouble began. Her mother was adamantly opposed to this match. Not only was the attorney much older than Blanche was, but he had little money of his own. For this reason, Madame Monnier insisted that Blanche find someone more suitable. When Blanche threatened to run away and elope, wrong move, her family took extreme action. They locked Blanche up in an upstairs bedroom and insisted that she would only be released if she agreed to never see her intended again. Though Madame Monnier and the rest of the family likely thought Blanche would give in, she remained adamant. As the years passed, Blanche stayed in her prison, with no sunlight and only being fed scraps from her mother's meals. Even after her lover died in 1885, the imprisonment continued, while her family told everyone that she had disappeared. But it wasn't just the Monniers who were part of the conspiracy to keep Blanche imprisoned. Various servants would later testify that they had often heard Blanche's pleas to be released but didn't say anything, whether due to loyalty to their employers, belief that Blanche was actually insane, or fear of being arrested as accessories to her imprisonment. To this day, nobody knows who wrote that note that eventually secured Blanche's release. Whether it was a servant or someone who had heard about her secondhand is anybody's guess. When Blanche was finally released, the story quickly became international news. Newspapers christened Blanche Le Séquestre des Portiers, and public outrage against the Monniers reached a fever pitch. This outrage grew as more details about her imprisonment became available. Neighbours even threatened to destroy the house belonging to two of the Monniers' servants, since they had apparently been complicit in her imprisonment. All that remained was to determine what could be done for Blanche and punish those that were responsible. When Madame Monnier was arrested for her role in her daughter's 25-year imprisonment, she was likely astonished at the angry mobs that had gathered about the prison where she was kept. Considering her former place in Poitiers society, the sight of many of her old neighbours and acquaintances yelling and threatening her with revenge must have been a substantial blow to her already poor health. Almost immediately, she was placed in the prison infirmary, where doctors could monitor her condition. Not that she survived for long. On the 9th of June, 1901, just 15 days after her arrest, Madame Monnier died unexpectedly from heart disease. Newspapers speculated that her condition had deteriorated after the judge's examination of the case, just days before, which caused her to realise the full gravity of what she had done. According to one account, doctors reported that her last words were, "Oh, my poor Blanche." Madame Monnier's death basically meant that her son, Marcel, would stand trial alone for his role in Blanche's imprisonment. Marcel insisted that his mother was mainly responsible and he had only gone along with it out of filial piety. He also added that his nearsightedness had kept him from seeing how terrible her living conditions actually were. Despite his claims, it's probably not surprising that he needed police protection to keep him safe from the crowds while his case came to trial. Marcel's wife and daughter were targeted as well, despite their insistences that they had no idea what was happening. After the story erupted, both of them retreated to a convent for their own protection. Ironically, Marcel's daughter, a beautiful 17-year-old socialite, had been engaged to be married to a well-respected French officer, but this was quickly cancelled due to the horrendous publicity of the case. In the meantime, Blanche continued to improve slowly in the hospital where she was being treated. Though doctors determined that she was no longer in danger of dying, nobody had any real expectation that she would ever fully recover. As one news story noted, when she was removed from her mother's house to the hospital, she had almost lost the use of her tongue. She could only stammer a few words and could not frame a complete sentence. Little by little, the power of speech has returned to her. She recognises flowers, birds, and articles which were once familiar to her. As story after story came to be written about the case, the house where Blanche had been kept became a ghoulish tourist attraction. Hundreds of visitors made the pilgrimage to the house on Rue de la Visitation and lined up to see the covered windows of Blanche's prison. It has also become apparent soon enough that the imprisonment had not been all that secret. Many of the neighbours admitted to being aware that Blanche had been locked away, but They had accepted her mother's claim that it was due to her being insane and not wanting to send her to the asylum. Others told newspaper reporters that they had often heard Blanche screaming at times. One neighbour reported that she had heard her scream, "Oh God, when will they set me free? Why am I imprisoned here? I am suffering the tortures of the damned." This was 8 years after she had first been locked up, but again, nothing had been done. Considering the stigma surrounding mental illness in 19th century France, and most other places, it was hardly uncommon for insane relatives to be locked up in a cellar or attic so they could be kept out of sight. Though Blanche had shown no symptoms to suggest that she was going mad, hardly anyone raised awkward questions when her mother and brother shut her away. Virtually every old family had a mad relative or two, so why should the Monniers be any different? When Marcel Monnier finally went on trial, the audience was packed with Blanche's supporters, all of whom wanted to see him go to prison. Testifying on his own behalf, Marcel insisted that he had no control over his mother, who ruled the household with an iron fist. She also controlled the family wealth, and going against her will would have meant financial ruin for him and his family. He also insisted that he did what he could for his sister, including going into her room and reading the newspaper to her on a regular basis. As for the servants themselves, they testified that they were used to the appalling conditions since, quote, "It had been like that when I got there." Classic diffusion of moral responsibility. Many of the servants were even expected to stay in the room with Blanche in case she needed anything, except, obviously, her freedom. Part of the problem that the court faced in prosecuting Marcel was that he hadn't actually done anything illegal. There was no law at the time against locking up insane relatives. The only one who had broken any laws was Blanche's mother, who was already dead. On October the 11th, largely to satisfy the mob mentality of the public, the court eventually sentenced Marcel to 15 months in prison. Hearing of the verdict, the courtroom erupted in applause, which quickly spread to the large crowd waiting outside. Alas, this public approval was short-lived. Almost immediately, Marcel appealed the sentence. I did mention he was a lawyer, right? During his appeal hearing, Marcel's attorney insisted that Blanche had been free to leave any time she wanted and that no violence had been used against her. Once again, the fact that Marcel hadn't broken any laws came into play. Finally, on November 30th, the appeal court overturned the previous sentence and Marcel Monnier was a free man. Though the people in the courtroom were horrified, there was no attempt at overturning this decision. Marcel eventually inherited his mother's estate, except for the house where Blanche had been kept, and retired to a country house far from Poitiers, where he died happily in 1913. As for Blanche herself, she recovered to some extent and even gained a little weight, but she was never able to rejoin society. Eventually placed in a sanitarium in Boy, she also passed away in 1913, 12 years after being rescued from her family home. Aside from a book written about the case by André Gide in 1930, her story remains little known outside of France. The house where she had been kept is still standing, though it has been extensively remodelled inside and out. Nothing remains of the room where Blanche spent so many years, locked away from the outside world. Humans are social animals. We have evolved surrounded by our own kind. We find isolation so inherently uncomfortable that It's how we punish society's worst offenders. Put him in the hole. Solitary confinement. It's just not a natural state to exist in. We've known for a while that isolation is physically bad for us. Chronically lonely people have higher blood pressure, are more vulnerable to infection, and are also more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Loneliness also interferes with a whole range of everyday functioning, such as sleep patterns, attention and logical and verbal reasoning. The mechanisms behind these effects are still unclear, though what is known is that social isolation unleashes an extreme immune response, a cascade of stress hormones and inflammation. This may have been appropriate in our early ancestors when being isolated from the group carried a big physical risk, but for us the outcome is just mostly harmful in our modern day. Yet some of the most profound effects of loneliness are actually on the mind. For starters, isolation messes with your sense of time. One of the strangest effects is that of time shifting, reported by those who have spent long periods living underground without daylight. In 1961, French geologist Michel Jeffery led a 2-week expedition to study an underground glacier beneath the French Alps and ended up staying 2 months. Fascinated by how the darkness affected human biology, he decided to abandon his watch and, quote, live like an animal. While conducting tests with his team on the surface, they discovered it took him 5 minutes to count to what he thought was 120 seconds. So this shows that the passage of time appears to shift after periods of extreme isolation. Maybe this should give us some hope. Think about it this way. If you ever find yourself in a position like that of Mademoiselle Blanche Monnier, locked away for 25 years, maybe what is actually 25 years on the outside will only feel like a decade or so to you. A decade stuck without light, screaming into the nothingness whilst your mind slowly rots away from the droning monotony of your daily existence. Psh, 10 years of that, easy.
Evening.